So let's start formally. Good evening. I'm Dibyesh, Professor Dibyesh Anand. I'm from University of Westminster, which is the university that's hosting you and hosting the event today. As some of you are new here or not so new, you'd see there's so many cameras, which does imply they're here for someone important, and that's not me, right? But anyway. So I wanted to give you a brief introduction to our university, the center that's hosting this talk, and then, of course, the speaker. So University of Westminster is very committed on supporting research knowledge exchange that makes an impact on communities, talking about issues of social justice. That's a broader thing which we have. And within that, we have got Center for the Study of Democracy. So the director of the center, some of you might know her, Dr. Natasha Kaul. She sends her regards. She could not be here, but she sent a regard and, of course, wanted me to welcome you and others on her behalf. The center is a center which has been there since 1989. We have explored all aspects of democracy, the theory, the practice. We looked at theories of democracy in different parts of the world, but there's a very strong emphasis again on engaging with the communities. And that's important because many universities will talk about things, they'll write about it, they'll produce books and articles, but they'll never engage with communities directly. So an example would be that, let's say I work on Tibet, I write on Tibetan culture, but when it comes to contemporary challenges that contemporary Tibetans face today, I'll keep quiet because somehow it's political. We are not that. And I can guess the fact that we are doing this kind of thing tells you that very clearly we do not shy away from difficult conversations, because the whole purpose of education and universities is to provide space for frank conversation on different issues. We have hosted different issues on Tibet for the last 15 years, and I have done that. I'm the one who works on it. We have hosted the delegations from China. We have had Tibetans who are officials in China coming and speaking in this very room. We have had the previous Sikyong, Dr. Lobsang Sangye, coming and speaking to my students. But of course, we have had His Holiness Dalai Lama, who was here. We have that, and on that, I'm very honored and privileged to have Sikyong Penpa Tsering. You may not remember, but I have met you in 2007. Oh, you remember? Oh, good. So at least I'm not that forgettable.
Because you're unique.
Oh, no, and this is before a major protest in Tibet in 2008. December 2007 is when I started wanting to engage with Tibetans. I was writing about them, but not engaging. It was through a particular organization, FNV, I think, and I was put in touch with TPPRC.
Yes.
And we had that discussion, and I remember being so, I have to say, taken aback, but also so impressed with what you were doing at Tibetan Parliamentary Policy Research Center. What you were doing there, that you were creating a space where Tibetans, non-Tibetans, they could come together to have a conversation. That's how I saw it. Right? Then we have not met since then, but I do know that you did that work. So Sikyong, for those of you who don't know, is the political leader. So I was explaining to everyone that he's not the Dalai Lama. I'm sorry, no, he's not the Dalai Lama, but he is the political leader. And given that Dalai Lama has retired as political leader, he's a symbol of the nation. He's the most important figure. We all know it. He's the spirit and everything of Tibetan nation. But the political leader is Sikyong, the political leader. So Penpa Tsering, he since 2001 was leading TPPRC, that center. He has been a parliamentarian for more than one term. He was a speaker for 2 terms. He was representing government in exile, which is also called Central Tibetan Administration, in Washington for a year. And since 2021, so that's almost 2 years, he has been the political leader, the elected political leader. Again, for Tibetans, you know what that means. But for non-Tibetans, just imagine. You have got Tibet and Tibetans facing colonization, occupied country. But you have got a small but a very dynamic and thriving and politically active diaspora that has a full-fledged democracy. So on that note, and he symbolizes that democracy. Thank you so much for giving us time.
Thank you.
I asked him to speak for first 10 minutes, and then I have a few questions for him, and we'll have time for audience question and answer. Can I make a request all of you to make sure that your phone is on silent and no odd kind of rings? But that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Dibyesh Anand. The first subject you have kept is very wide. You have human rights in there, you have China, Tibet, a whole lot of things, including democracy, which is the important component of the discussion tonight. So the first 10 minutes, I'll focus on democracy. Then when we have the interaction sessions, then we can continue, talk about human rights, we can talk about China, Tibet, whatever I know. I'll try my best to respond to your queries and questions. Tibetan democracy, I think it can be traced back to His Holiness thinking. So when Tibet was invaded by China in 1950, Chamdo in 1950, October 1950, then we were forced to sign this 17-point agreement in 1951. That's the only agreement that we have with People's Republic of China. And His Holiness tried to live under those provisions of the agreement for 8 long years. That's from 51 to 59. And within that period, His Holiness traveled to China in 1954-55, and he met with Mao and Zhou Enlai and all other communist leaders those days. And he saw how communist government functioned. Even though everything looked very orderly, people had no freedom to speak. Then His Holiness was in India in 1956-57, and then he visited the Indian Parliament. Even though it did seem quite chaotic, people had the freedom to speak. And that was what got His Holiness' attention. And when we came into exile in 1959, His Holiness landed on Indian soil on March 31st, 1959. And not even 1 year after coming into exile, on 3rd February 1960, even though we were going through very difficult times, my parents, the younger generations of Tibetans who were here, some of it could be grandparents for some of them, we were not used to Indian climate, we were not used to Indian diet, and many people died because of that. Later we were put up in the foothills of Himalayas because we had no skill whatsoever. The only thing we could do was hard labor, and our people were involved in road construction. Now if you go to northern India, particularly in Himachal and other states in northern India, many of those roads were built by Tibetans those days. But even under those very difficult circumstances, His Holiness said that we should have representative government. And 7 months after that, we had the first parliament, even though the election at that time could not be held as we do today, but there was a semblance of representative. And the reason why His Holiness went for provincial and religious traditional representatives is because His Holiness wanted to reinforce the national identity of all the 3 provinces together. That is Central Tibet, Usang, Amdo, Kham, because they are varied historical backgrounds. And this is the first time after coming into exile since the 7th to 9th century that His Holiness created a national identity of all the Tibetans in all of all the 3 provinces together. So we had our first parliament in 1960, 2nd of September. So even now we celebrate 2nd of September as Democracy Day. And His Holiness was, I consider him a true Democrat at heart. So he worked on developing a constitution for future Tibet. There was a draft constitution in 1961, 62, and they referred to experts, and again, His Holiness consulted with many other Tibetans and came out with this future Constitution for Future Tibet. And this was promulgated in 1963 on March 10th. And since then, we have been following that future Constitution and working on that from 1960 to 1990. For the first 30 years, we had to, particularly His Holiness, had to face a lot of challenges because our people had no idea what democracy meant. we didn't know anything about democratic organs and accountability and answerability and all that. So for the first 6 years, the parliament could not be convened as a parliament. The parliamentarians were even put up with the administration to gain experience. So only in 1966, we had a proper office for the parliamentarians. And since then, they tried to frame laws as much as possible in accordance with the situation of those days. Then eventually, of course, for the first 30 years, the number of members of parliament were also, the minimum was 12, and the maximum was 17. There was also a period when there were reservation for women in the parliament, and when there was reservation, it went up to 17. When there was no reservation, it came down to 13, 14, and sometimes His Holiness nominates a direct candidate, and if that happens, then it becomes 13, then 12 least. In 1990, we had these 12 to 17 parliamentarians, and all the ministers used to be appointed by His Holiness because we never took the responsibility on all those issues. Then in 1990, just few years before 1990, His Holiness started talking about more changes. And by 1990, he dissolved both the parliament and the cabinet and held a special meeting in May 1990, representing all people from all walks of life, including people who have just started coming out from Tibet. And some of the agenda were whether we should have a bicameral house or not. We are still unicameral. Whether we should have a prime ministerial post or not, whether we should have a political party or not, whether we should increase the number of members or not. So these were some of the issues that were discussed during this special meeting, and we could not agree on all others except increasing the number from 13 at that time to 46 members. So the representation also comes from the 3 provinces of Tibet. So we still don't have territorial constituencies as you have here in the UK. If we do not consider Europe as a territorial constituency. And we are also represented through the Buddhist, the religious traditions. So one religion, which is the pre-Buddhist religion called Pon, they elect 2 members, and then the other 4 Buddhist traditions, they elect 2 to 2 members, so 10 members, and each of the province, irrespective of the number of electorate, elect 10 members each, because as you can see from the Tibetan map, the border between central Tibet and India is more than 3,600 kilometers, and because of the proximity of the border, more Tibetans could come from central Tibet, and less so from Kham, and still less from Amdo, which is farthest away from India. And if you look at the composition of the provincial people in exile now, about 69 to 70% are from central Tibet, 22 to 25% are from Kham, and maybe 5 to 7 from Amdo. But irrespective of those numbers, everybody elects 10 members. So I think Dechen and you did a program also on the representation part. Maybe this we can discuss during the question and answer session. So in 1991, we had 46 members, 2 from Europe at that time, and 1 from North America, because there were more Tibetans in Europe those days. Now you have more Tibetans in North America, and His Holiness used to nominate 3 members from fields of expertise, and, whether it's education or other areas. So it was 46 till then in 2001, His Holiness actually wanted the parliament to be responsible to appoint the ministers in 1991. But we couldn't do that. In the charter that we adopted in 1991 and 1992, then the parliament became a meaningful legislative body. Then the parliament adopted what we practice now, the charter. We call it the charter, we don't call it constitution because we still live in India and India has a constitution, so there can't be two constitutions in one country. So we call it the charter. Now, based on this charter, we govern the Tibetans in exile. Then in 2001, His Holiness again suggested, and just before that, by that time I was already in the parliament. I joined the parliament in 1996 till 2016. And in 2001, then His Holiness suggested we have to, I will not live forever, and things will have to change. First, he suggested amendment, we changed that, and then again he said, now why don't we do it on a larger scale? Why can't we have direct election of the political leader within the Tibetan community? So we had the first election of the Khalön Chöba at that time. It was not known as Sikyong. Khalön Chöba is the head of the cabinet, or the throne holder of the cabinet. So Professor Samdong Rinpoche was elected. Professor Samdong Rinpoche was speaker before that for 10 years in the parliament, and he guided us through democratic principles in the parliament and procedures. And we consider ourselves as grandson of Westminster democracy, India being the son and we being the grandson. And again, 10 years after that, His Holiness decided that we should have more changes, so we had direct election. Then 10 years after that, His Holiness said, now, by that time we could sense, I was already speaker from 2008, and His Holiness asked us to accompany him during the foreign tours so that there is some sense of recognition for the elected leadership. And I accompanied His Holiness to Switzerland, United States, and that was a means for His Holiness to introduce the political leaders to the general public and to the international community. In 2011, I was the speaker when the whole devolution process took place. And we managed to do it in a short time. And just after that, we visited the United States. I hope you will, some of the Tibetans might remember, His Holiness was holding me on with his right hand, and left hand was Lobsang Sengye, who was just elected as Khalön Chöba at that time. And His Holiness said, today I brought 2 new people. And the Speaker of the House of Representatives was John Boehner. There was the former Speaker Pelosi, and chairs of 5 important committees. So it was a powerful group that met with His Holiness, and I was sitting on His Holiness' right. And morning, His Holiness said, if there are questions about political issues, you answer. If there are questions about democracy, you answer. So that fell on me. One of the lady chair asked, how did you go through these changes so peacefully and in so short a time? And then I was responding to her saying that you see it that way, but me being the Speaker of the House and then the Parliament, we were sandwiched between the aspiration of the Tibetan people who insist that His Holiness should not devolve his powers or responsibilities. And then you have His Holiness on the other side, very strong and determined, willing to take decisions even against people's aspirations, because that is what he feels is good for the Tibetan people. And then when I was saying this, His Holiness held my hand and then said, sometimes very stubborn Dalai Lama. So a leader who's willing to take the society forward, even if people are not willing at that time, because people are diffident. His Holiness had been taking all the responsibilities. So since then, Lobsang got elected. He was Sikyong, first Khalön Chöba, then we changed the name to Sikyong when I was the speaker. I was speaker till 2016. And Lobsang served as Sikyong for 10 years, and since 2021, now I have been serving it. We are only 130,000 Tibetans in exile. About about 72,000 in India, about 10,000 in Nepal, and 1,500 in Bhutan, and the rest, 50,000 spread all across the world in more than 25 different countries. So if you have to stand for my position, then you have to, if you have the resources and the time, you have to campaign in more than 25 different countries and so many locations in India, Nepal, and Bhutan. But fortunately for me, during the last election, it was pandemic period, and I didn't go out of my house. So I campaigned online from my house while building a small house for myself. I was working and also campaigning. And that proved to be a success. And today I'm the Sikong, and my responsibility is towards my people. So I make it a point. During my last 2 years, I traveled all across India, now except for 4 or 5 settlements in India, which I'll be covering after my return from here. I'm going straight to Simla, so I've not covered some places in Himachal Pradesh. Otherwise, I covered all the Tibetan settlements, not just go there and speak to the public and come back, but visit every single camp, every single institution, and also make an assessment of the needs of the community. So now we have a supermarket of needs in Dharamsala, which we need to now deliver in this year, the coming 2 years. So this is where we are. We are the only partyless democracy in the world. We have no political parties, even now. Acharya Vinoba Bhave, one famous philosopher of India, has spoken or written about partyless democracy, but there's no practicing partyless democracy. It's only us. So we don't have territorial constituencies. So when you don't have parties, you don't have ruling party and opposition party also. So when I asked one of my friends who came from Switzerland representing Europe, I asked him, how's your feeling? He says, in the West, any issue that comes, before it comes to the parliament, it's debated, you have expert committees and all that. But in Dharamsala, we don't have that. So every single person is like a political party. Unless you surrender your own conscience to somebody else, you have a full right to decide on your own based on issues that come up in the parliament from time to time. So that is how we function. Maybe I took more than 10 minutes, so I'll stop here. During the interactive session, we can take more questions. Okay. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much. Very important points you made. So to summarize, again, I'm looking at people who are not very familiar. You reminded us of how, of course, the uniqueness of the democracy first. It's a very unique experimentation because it's not directly connected to a territory that exists, right? And I'll come to Tibet soon. That's one. The second part you raised is also important, of where people think, oh, each person should have one vote, which people have, but also the representation about how many you are and what it represents. But what you're reminding us is that in Tibetan democratic context, it is about creating a nation in exile. That's how, if you look at since 1960, His Holiness was very clear that the priority are Tibetan people and representing them. So even people from Amdo would be smaller in numbers, Kham much smaller or slightly bigger. The idea is to treat all of them equally, even though some from central Tibet might feel it's unfair because they are more in number, they don't get the seats, right? But it was very clear that democracy was a tool to bring the nation together, and which is very rare. And third thing you pointed out, of course, is, which is again unique, is here the democracy was pushed by the leader. Because most people who know, most Tibetans and people not Tibetan but know Tibet, know that if His Holiness didn't do it and didn't want it, it would not have happened. So in a way it was forced upon people, right? That's the third thing to remember, that the centrality of His Holiness. But the challenge that you all faced in the last 10 years were where, while he's the center, he also doesn't want to be the center, and he wants you all to be the center, where everyone doesn't, well, they might not want you to be the center. Right? So that's the tension in democracy, which you have managed so well. You reminded us of the importance of non-violence here. And just imagine elections in US. I mean, how horrible the election system is in US. They can't get anything right in any state. And in this case, you have to run election in exile, in countries, including Bhutan, where you might not be allowed to do it, or in Nepal where the ballot boxes might be taken away, and that's what happens. In Indian context, think India, imagine how big India is and where the settlements are, right? So you have that experimentation. So I would start by reminding everyone that it is a democracy that everyone should study as an example of how to run. Doesn't mean it might be all perfect, but it's very much there. Now, in that context, where do Tibetans in Tibet come? So I understand that in exile you have a democracy and you're representing the people. But if someone says, but how do you represent Tibetans in Tibet, who are more than 5.8 million, so you're very small. So what is your claim for representing them?
Now, according to the latest Chinese demographic survey, the Tibetan population is a little more than 7 million inside Tibet, and they have no freedom at all. Tibet is almost locked down. Nobody can go in, nobody can go out. Only about a few weeks ago, we hear rumors that the government might start issuing passports back to the people. All the passports are confiscated by the government, so there's no scope for people to travel, and you are not allowed to come in to Tibet. So that affects our communication also. Our information gathering from inside Tibet has become much more difficult. But the overall situation inside Tibet in terms of politics, of course, there's no space, political space to do anything. And any activity, political activity of one person is linked to the welfare of their kins and friends and families, because you know that 157 Tibetans have, according to our CTA's data, some say 158, some say 159, but according to Central Tibetan Administration's database, it's 157 Tibetans. 157 Tibetans have self-immolated so far, hoping against hope that the Chinese government will pay some attention to their plight, or hoping against hope that the international community will come to their rescue, but to no avail so far. But I keep reminding our people that their efforts will not go in vain. It will be cumulative effort of all of us, past and present and future, that will bring result to the Sino-Tibet conflict. So politically, it's like a gridlock system. Where you can't do anything. Your Chinese government uses, because you know Chinese government spend more money on internal security than external security. Maybe China is the only government who does that. So everything they invest in artificial intelligence, whether it's electronic identification, where they watch your movement, including geolocation. And lately now we have been hearing reports. In fact, those things have been happening since 2010, 2013 in different parts of Tibet, but we hear it only now about DNA profiling of the Tibetans. And some people ask us, what do the Chinese government do with all this DNA profiling? The worst case scenario is Chinese scientists has managed to change DNA. So if they change DNA of all the 7 million Tibetans, another 20, 30 years down the line, they can claim that there was never ever a Tibetan race. I don't know whether it'll go to that level or not, but now we hear about iris scanning of people. So all these are aimed at control, 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 and more control, and less and less and less freedom for people, including movement. This is the political angle to this. And then with the identity of the Tibetan, particularly to do with language. Now, UN special rapporteurs have come out with a report on the colonial-style boarding schools, where more than 1 million Tibetan students are now put in boarding schools from the age of 6 to 18, according to Tibet Action Institute's report. And then we did some study between the age of 3 to 6, and we found that over the last few years, it used to be several thousand. Now it has gone beyond 150,000 children in boarding schools. Now, when these kids come home, they are all withdrawn. They don't speak the Tibetan language. They speak only Chinese. That is what they are taught there, because the medium of instruction is Mandarin. That is what Xi Jinping is hoping, that China will have only one language, one nation, one language, one culture, and sometimes I even say one religion, because every religion, China gives a red brush, brush it with communism. And now, even if you know Tibetan, it's very difficult to have a livelihood.
My only suggestion is that don't think of what is happening, or think of what the system can allow. And in case of China, the system can allow any change to take place without any challenge from Tibetans or for Chinese people themselves, because China is an authoritarian system which is authoritarian even for Chinese people. So even if Chinese scientists and Chinese scholars or Chinese civil society will say, look, what is happening in Tibet is not right, we should recognize them as equal, etc., they have no space to do it. Right? That's a big difference you have to understand between colonial system, which is China in Tibet, and elsewhere. Now, another question which is related to it. So I understand that all kind of oppression, human rights denial, lack of freedom in Chinese occupied Tibet. That's clear. But how does, because I know His Holiness has said something, so I would like your view on it. Because the Dalai Lama often says that the ultimate decision about Tibet's future has to be decided by Tibetans in Tibet. Right? Now, how does democracy in exile actually try to represent voices of Tibet, given that Tibetans are largely under colonization and therefore they can't express? So what are the mechanisms through which you can try to get their voice out?
It has become more difficult now. Till the late 80s, there were not too many Tibetans who came out of Tibet. If you remember, His Holiness started thinking about the middle way approach way back in 1973 when the...
Can you explain middle way for people who might not know a bit?
Yeah, we can discuss more about that, but let me start from there. 1973 onwards, he started thinking about a middle way. That was during the throes of Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. It was at the height of Cultural Revolution, where everything was being destroyed. Everything old was destroyed. In the whole of China, more so in Tibet. So we were, I think His Holiness must have also gone through the same emotions, whether the Tibetan identity will remain at all or not. So that's why he started thinking about the middle way. And then Deng Xiaoping said something to the effect that we can discuss about anything other than independence. So since then, we sent several fact-finding delegations into Tibet in the early 80s, when there were a little more liberal-minded Chinese leaders like Deng Xiaoping, Hu Yaobang. Then that also, when Hu Jintao became party secretary in Tibet, then he imposed the martial law, and then it worsened and worsened and worsened. So, where were we? I was going somewhere.
I said, how do you represent voices?
Represent the Tibet. So, now in the late 80s, some Tibetans started coming out into exile. Then the early 90s, then more Tibetans started coming out. Till 2008, we used to receive between 2,500 to 3,000 Tibetans every year. And many of them are small children, below 10 years of age, many of them. And they are left behind in India to study for education, not knowing whether they will ever meet their families again or not. So this has been going on. In 2008, there was large-scale demonstration all over Tibet, participated by people from all walks of life. And since then, China started curbing on Tibetan's movement, put more pressure on Nepalese government, and they realized that people cannot travel on their own illegally over the Himalayas without a guide, so they removed all the guides from Lhasa. So without guides, it's almost impossible to come out on your own without, So those things have been happening. And when there were movement of people from inside Tibet, and then traders also going into Tibet, the information flow was much better than what it is now. Since 2008, the number of Tibetans coming into exile have been coming down. In 2020, just a year before I took over Sikyong's job, only 5 people had managed to come out. 2021, only 10 people managed to come out. 2022, only 4 people managed to come out. And 2023, this year, so far, we received only 11 people. 3 monks, 2 kids, and the rest are. So that also affects our communication. So the WeChat, which is the main application used by Tibetans, because they can't use any other apps in Tibet or China unless you know how to use VPN or allowed to use VPN for some sectors. Only a few people who are allowed to do that. You have no access to information. So Indian government also, because of the border war with China, they have banned WeChat. US, because of the trade war, they have banned WeChat. So the forms of communication becomes narrower and narrower. But despite all that, we still try to find both conventional and modern technology, use of modern technology to gather as much information as possible from inside Tibet. So as we discussed about the 90s and all that, there were Tibetans coming out and we could consult with them and we could get their views, their understanding. Right now it has become more difficult, but then radios also play an important role, like the Voice of Tibet from Norway, Radio Free Asia, Voice of America from the United States. But there also a lot of jamming by the Chinese government. Then social media is definitely, now Tibetans are also becoming more innovative in circumventing the firewalls, and then they also learned how to send messages attached behind WeChat. So those communications still continue, but it's not as much as we would have liked to know about inside Tibet. But we definitely keep their sentiments, their sensitivities in mind when we reach out to the international community.
Yeah, in fact, I have a question which will come to middle way. So, right now, of course, Tibetans are occupied by China, and of course, you fled, and late 1950s, the revolt was for independence against China. You came out. Now, of course, Dalai Lama, for various reasons, pragmatic and looking at other reasons, decided that it should be middle way. So, not full independence, which is Rangzen, and not being part of China, complete colonization, but middle way, which is genuine autonomy. So, like he uses the language genuine autonomy. Now, since from my understanding is genuine autonomy, middle way is a political demand / political strategy / political vision. Now, given that His Holiness has retired as a political leader and shifted responsibility on to you all as a democracy, why would CTA and you all, I mean, why would you stick to middle way given that now His Holiness wants you to take responsibility? So is there a rethinking going on middle way given that in any case China has not responded at all to middle way?
Not yet. There are not much demands about revision of that. If there are more demands, then it's a democratic setup. There are mechanisms in place how we should proceed with that, whether we should have a referendum or not. Again, if we go back to 1959, after His Holiness came to India, he declared that wherever His Holiness and his cabinet is where the Tibetan government is. And a few days later, the Indian government sent a representative saying that we don't recognize government in exile. So if India does not recognize, which is the closest to us, then it's very difficult to convince other governments. So from what I know, His Holiness said that since that time, he didn't insist on other governments to accept Tibetan government in exile. Similar is the case here in UK. We have our historical ties with United Kingdom. under the British Empire. We had, I think, more than 100 years of association with British India, and more particularly after young husband expedition into Tibet in 1904 and signing of the agreement, the 13th Dalai Lama having to flee to Mongolia and China, 1914 Shimla Agreement, and all that. So again, going back to 70s, 60s, and 70s, we were going through very, very difficult time. I think His Holiness is always a very pragmatic person, very practical person. So he looked at the situation internationally where there's no recognition of independent Tibet from any country. If you talk about independence, then all doors get shut. Maybe there are individual members of parliament, individual politicians who support independence for Tibet, but that does not galvanize into an international effort in gaining independence for Tibet. So really keeping these realities and the international realities and the reality within Tibet, His Holiness went for the middle way. But there was no specification of what middle way meant from 1973 till 1987. So His Holiness, for the first time, came out with his 5-point peace plan addressed to the US Human Rights Caucus. At that time, we had very few friends in the Senate and the House. But that was the beginning of the formulation of the middle way. And then in 1988, His Holiness expanded on the 5th point, which deals with negotiation. And then in 1989, there was a possibility of a dialogue, but that also dissipated very soon. Then His Holiness wanted to seek a recourse on what the Tibetan people think about the future course of action. And then we wanted to go through a process of referendum, but before the referendum, there was a public opinion, and majority of the Tibetans said that we will abide by whatever His Holiness decides, depending on the situation inside China, in Tibet, and internationally. Then His Holiness reiterated that he will continue with the middle way approach and still continue to do that. So middle way can take different forms. It's the genuine autonomy is not necessarily a political term in political science. Even autonomy, definition of autonomy in international law is it varies, because every autonomous state in this world are different in its forms, and the competencies that the autonomous states have and the central governments have, I think it all depends on what kind of negotiation takes place and who has the upper hand during the negotiations. So even for Tibet also, what form of autonomy, we talk about degrees of autonomy, it cannot be measured on a scale. It has to be based on what are the competencies that the central government has and what the autonomous state has. So here, right now, during my Sikyongship, I'm just talking about avoiding extreme polarities. One polarity is the independent Tibet. The other polarity is the present situation under communist China right now. So we have to find a middle way, essentially addressing the Tibetan people's right to speak their language, to preserve and promote their religion, to preserve their culture, their Buddhist culture, the peaceful culture, the compassionate culture, and Tibetan people's way of life, and also the right for ourselves to protect our environment, which is not only important for Tibet, as I mentioned before.
Quick before I open it to audience. Now, in terms of given the situation in Tibet, which is quite dire, China being very powerful, despite what you say, and then of course the, let's say, lack of support for any strong solution or push from international community, where do you get hope from?
From the Buddhist thinking that nothing is permanent. Everything is impermanent. Western psychologists also say that change is the only constant. So China will also have to change. Of course, everybody says that China is very powerful militarily, politically, economically. So, but how much ever I try to analyze, I spend a lot of time studying China, read a lot of news that comes out, and also watch the situation. But I find China very insecure today, maybe more insecure than they have ever been. So under Xi Jinping, not more than, of course, that convention was there, but reinforced more during Xi Jinping's time that not more than 3 Politburo members can meet together without the express permission of the president, which means that they are afraid of internal coup. Then under Xi Jinping, in the last 3-4 years, he has been transferring all the generals. He doesn't let them stay in one place to make sure that the generals does not build better relations with the cadres. And military coup is also ruled out. Then we talked about China spending more money on internal security than external security, which itself manifests a deep distrust between the rulers and the ruled. And then what do you think China keeps all these flashpoints burning, whether it's on border issue with India, unprovoked belligerence, and then with Senkaku or Spratlys, with Japan, Taiwan, and in the whole of South China Sea. Everybody has a problem with China. So who's to blame when everybody has a problem with China? So China is not, and the only power they lack is the moral power. Nobody trusts them. Even now, nobody trusts them. But then, now some business people are thinking it's opportunity for them. So everybody is now rushing to China. And when I speak to governments, I tell them, you have to watch those steps where you get the whole international community is getting this feeling that the Western power is ebbing, their influence is ebbing, and China's influence is growing. And we are making that happen. We made China what it is today. I tell the Americans, I tell the Europeans, I tell the Japanese, I tell the Taiwanese also, we are all to be blamed for creating this monster, what it is today. So when I go to Europe, I tell them we need more transatlantic cooperation, not competition when it comes to China. And we also tell them, please don't look at us as victims of, only from the perspective of victims of communism. If you can look at us from the point of a partner, that is because if you want to bring positive changes inside China in future, you need both internal and external forces. And we are the internal forces, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Mongols, Manchus. The Manchu is almost gone. There's hardly anybody who speaks Manchukuo language in Manchuria, and the Hong Kongers, and even Taiwanese. You know, we are the internal forces. So with both the forces coming together, there will be better chances to change China. And we all have to make that effort. And we also, even with the British Foreign Secretary's statement yesterday, I'm not against completely isolating China. It cannot happen. We live in an interdependent world. But then the UK government also has to be very, very careful and very, very strategic in how they approach on which issue and what, with whom, how effective, looking at all the consequences. Otherwise, another 5-10 years down the line, you will still be repenting. And I remember many years back when David Cameron was to go to China, Chinese wolf warriors were saying, oh, UK used to be a big empire. Now it's a small country, no influence. I think that's how they treat you. They don't treat you equal. But when it comes to the United States, they always say, oh, United States doesn't treat us equal. But is China treating Japan equal? Is China treating India equal, which are the two powerhouses in Asia? So they want to be on top, and they want to be leader of everything. They want to be number one of everything.
Okay. Thank you so much. We have time for a few questions. Who would like to raise? Now I realize we need a microphone. Could you help out? Sorry, we didn't arrange for someone to help out, so I have to ask a student of mine and my good friend.
Good evening. I am Poonam Pandey. I am an Indian journalist based in New Delhi. I cover defense basically for my newspaper called Navbharat Times. So my question is in two parts. We have seen China aggression in last 3 years all across LAC. Nor in Arunachal, but we have seen it in eastern Ladakh and in central sector, if we say it opposite Himachal. So do you think our present Indian government is able to take on China, or they will support you for free Tibet? And my second part of the question is, you also mentioned that China is imposing their language over Tibetan language. We generally keep these, getting these intelligence report that China is trying to influence that area. We called it Tibet military region, as we write it. They are trying to impose their language, and they make compulsory their language for the primary school there, and they are forcefully recruiting Tibetan youth in the PLA. So is it the case, and how you are fighting for your identity?
Thank you.
Now, when we speak with Indian politicians...
My question is related to... Oh, okay, let's take a... If it's related, then it's fine.
Please.
Okay. Wait, microphone.
My name is Shoaib Khan from Times of India. So my question is, like, since we have seen that the tension between India and China is all-time high, we would say. We have seen violence in Galwan Valley recently, I mean, last year. So in the light of that, how do you see the future of Tibetan movement in India? Why? Because we have seen that India has become a kind of, sensibilities. Indians become more sensible towards, like, Chinese occupation on Tibet. So will you be getting more freedom in India to raise your protests and demonstrations? Will you be getting more freedom in India to, like, build your momentum, of your movement? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that.
When I was starting with that, when we talk with Indian politicians, of course, many politicians say we support independent Tibet. And also among the general public also, they support independence for Tibet. But now, how do they translate into a government action? If we don't have support from the government, public opinion alone is not enough. And government's views might also change according to changing circumstances and changing realities. And in different circles also, there may be different interests advocating different positions. I don't want to go into detail of all those. But the aggression, the unprovoked belligerence in Ladakh, starting with Doklam and then Ladakh, and now in Tawang and all that, this has been happening for many years, actually. We know about incursions, we know about fights, all that, but those were not publicized those days. Now it's much more visible in the media. Maybe the media has become more active, or maybe the government thinks it's important to give the information to the media, so you cover it, every single of the incident that happens now, so people are more aware of what is happening. But otherwise, this has been going on, maybe not to the extent of killing each other and having physical fights on the border. So Indian government's position has also become much more stronger. So as of now, if there is no disengagement from all quarters, not just one or two areas, then there will be no normalization of relations. So that position, I think, is very valuable, because I have always said that if you know China, China will respect only strength. If you stand up to your position, to your values, then only China will respect you. If you don't stand up for your values, I even use this phrase, which some may not like, if you want to be the pony, China will keep riding you. So you decide whether UK or India or whoever it is, whether you want to be the pony and China be the rider, or you want to work on equal terms. That is necessary. Now, we can also see reflections of Indian government's administration's response to us from different means, when we organize protest demonstration, or whether they give us permit on time or not. All these are reflective of how government of India responds to the needs of the Tibetan community. And we can say right now, we enjoy a very transparent and close relationship with the government of India. I never hide anything from the government. We have had the best humanitarian support from the government of India. But when it comes to the expression of Indian government's policy towards China, His Holiness, when he used to be asked this question, he always said, when it comes to China, India is overcautious. Now I say maybe it's time to remove the over, but still cautious, because it's a long border. And you always have to face the reality, just like the Japanese have to face the maritime border with China, or Taiwan with China. So I cannot say for sure that Indian government would support free Tibet, which means, I don't know what you mean by that, but if you're talking about independent Tibet, maybe difficult. But in the minds and hearts of the Indian people, they like to support that. And we consider ourselves as an extension of Indian culture. We are not an extension of Chinese culture. Many people think that since Tibet is occupied by China, Tibetan language also must have something to do with Chinese language, which is not so. Tibetan language was derived from Indian script, the Gupta and the Brahmi script, in 7th century. We sent the King Sonzai Gampo sent his minister to study Tibetan language. And even now, if I read the Tibetan alphabets, you will find it very similar with the present-day Hindi alphabet. In Hindi is ka, kha, kha, ga, nga. In Tibetan is ka, kha, kha, nga. Cha, 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 nya, ta, 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 na, pa, 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 ma. Very simple, similar with Hindi. And Buddhism also came from India, not from China, even though Buddhism went to China before it reached, much before Buddhism came into Tibet. There were Chinese Buddhists also in Tibet in the 8th century. But there was a big debate. The Tibetan emperor held a big debate between the Indian masters and the Chinese masters. And the Indian masters won, and we adopted Buddhism from India directly, not from China. So all those connections, even though such simple, small information are not known to many people. So Chinese are now trying to say that Tibetan Buddhism also came from China. They are changing all narratives, including history, everything. So we have to be very careful about China and what they say. In terms of I'm sure there will be a lot of space to galvanize the Tibetan movement, and there's a lot more sympathy. And in my last 2 years, I have been traveling around India. I've been meeting with political leaders locally, and I've been meeting with Tibet support groups. Now, what I find very encouraging is that now more and more intellectuals are joining the Tibetan movement. So you have more doctors, more lawyers, more engineers. So more educated people are joining the Tibet. I spoke at Jammu University. I also spoke at All India Tibet Support Group Conference. I was also in Calcutta speaking to a group there. So now I can sense that more responsible people are becoming more aware of the situation. And otherwise, in India, foreign affairs is not a big thing. Even Indian politicians are not very good in foreign affairs because everybody is too busy.
You're very polite in saying you're very busy. They're totally ignorant, but anyway.
Yeah, they get too busy with, so I'll try to keep it short. And I hope we covered that. Then in Tibet, talking about the youth in PLA, They have been recruiting Tibetans in the Chinese army, but I don't think they sent them to the Indian border earlier, on other borders. But I tell the Indians, do you think the Chinese government will trust the Tibetans on the border with guns and weapons? Relationships, people's sensitivities. So that is where we need to, and now I realize that Indian Army is also learning Tibetan. Indian Army is also learning Tibetan culture and all that. I just spoke to a group just before coming here. So a lot of new developments are happening, and I see a lot more positive signs from India where we could definitely galvanize the Tibetan movement more than what we did.
And it's high time Indian military does it. So imagine 50, 60 years later. I mean, you're very polite and you have different view and my own view, but the level of ignorance around Tibet in India is so high amongst majority of people, including intellectuals and military officials, that you'd be shocked. But things are changing, you're right, things are changing maybe for better. That's the important part. One only comment I'll make, and it's a comment, it's a joke also, is I always find it interesting where a lot of Tibetans, including you and many Tibetans, talk of did culture or Buddhism come from India or from China, or where is it derived from? And for me, Tibetan culture is Tibetan. If anything, if you look at one Hindu god, an Indian god, Shiva, where does he come from? He's likely to be Tibetan. He was too wild, too interesting to be a Brahminical kind of god, right? And that comes from Tibet. So I think Indians should be very grateful for Tibet for whatever they have done in the past also. But anyway, move on. If you could keep your answer.
If I may, I just add one sentence. The underlying policy of Indian government, which I find interesting, is that they've still kept Indo-Tibetan border force, Indo-Tibetan border police, not Indo-China border force or Indo-China border police. That itself underlines India's policy.
Yeah, thanks. So we have got many more questions. We'll have to keep it brief. Yes?
Okay, my name is Adila Khan and I'm from Pakistan. My question may be a bit harsh, but you may have your differences with China. You may have your principal stance on yours, on your political stance. But don't you think that people around you, countries around you, may be fueling your anger, maybe aggravating your stance towards China a bit, like they did in the Ukraine and Russia war? Like they will be pressurizing you to go against China, go into war against China, and then when the time comes, they'll back off, and you will be there in the war field, and your people will be dying in the field. So don't you think that you have to manage your difference, you have to find the middle way?
That's what we are doing. We are following the middle way. Now, this question relates more towards whether we are being used or not. Or are we using the others? So it goes both ways. So I always say there are two realities when it comes to Tibet, Sino-Tibet conflict. One, if we have to resolve this peacefully, which we intend to do, we are committed to doing this in a non-violent way, then there's no other way than by talking to the Chinese leadership. If China does not break up like Soviet Union, then it will be a different thing. The second reality is that we have to reach out to the international community. And the Chinese government cannot take affront to all our efforts. That's our job to do it. But the reality is also that no nation will leave aside their national interests for the interests of the Tibetans. Only if it aligns with their own national interests and the Tibetan interests, then only it can come together. So everybody is looking at their own interests. We are also looking from our interests, but we also have to understand the situation that we are in and who do we work with, because we ourselves, as I said, we are only 130,000. And if it is not for the leadership of a personage like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I don't know where we would be It's 59, only 85,000 Tibetans. That time it must have been about 500, 600 million Indians. If Tibetans, 80,000 are distributed everywhere, today they won't be Tibetans speaking Tibetan. Tibetans would be speaking Punjabi, just like they speak Nepali. So in Karnataka, everybody will be speaking Kannada language, nothing to do with Tibetan. So we have been resilient in our approach. Even now, I say, we take one step at a time. With Chinese government, we have been taken for a ride for too long. So I never get overexcited just because there are some developments. It's important to be pragmatic. And we will be pragmatic. Don't worry. If you think, some people might say they might be using you, but then some people might think that Tibetans are using them, so it could be vice versa.
Yeah, that's geopolitics for you. Thank you. First, you had a question. Yeah. Oh, did you have a question? Oh, sorry, I didn't see. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, fine. After you. Yeah.
Okay.
But quick.
Yeah, hello. I'm Nasreen. I'm from Assam in Northeast India. So we understand Chinese aggression as well because we have faced it in Arunachal, which the term is South Tibet. And my question to you is, I have met many young Tibetans from Dharamshala who have also, many have also moved to Northeast India because, you know, there are some cultural similarities. So how do you keep the myth of the homeland alive? Because some of them, you know, have lost touch with some of their roots. I'm not saying that we've lost it all, but how do you, do you struggle to tell them about the homeland that they have lost, and how do you ensure that there is enough emotion in the movement going?
Now, one of the main generations changed, right? Now, if you come to Dharamsala now, and in the Central Tibetan administration, you won't find the generation that came from Tibet. Now it's our generation, like we were born in India. So that's the next generation, they are sitting here, some of them. Now it's their responsibility to take up the mantle of Tibetan movement in future. So what we try to do in India, Nepal, in India, it's still okay. Maybe you know, we spread across some 45 different locations, both compact and scattered communities. So it's always an effort to keep up with that. We have a lot of challenges to face, dispersing compact communities and all that. But despite all that, we now I've come out with a vision paper. The 16th cabinet has come out with the vision paper just very recently on 10th April. And that outlines how we intend to work. And one of the focus areas is definitely the youth. So when I travel around India, I try to go to every school. Of course, we have to go to every school and we speak to the children. And when we travel around cities, then we have to meet with the Tibetans who are going to universities, and we also have programs where young Tibetans come to Dharamsala for school children, university-going students, to introduce them to the Central Tibetan administration. When I travel outside, I always make it a point. I tell the Tibetan community, okay, one meeting with the Tibetan community, but a separate meeting with the youth. So here in UK also, I'll be meeting them separately. So I provide them with all the basic information about Tibet, and if we are able to catch their fascination and imagination for Tibet, then they will get involved. Now, this cabinet also has come out with a new initiative called the Voluntary Tibet Advocacy Group. So more and more Tibetans are moving out, particularly the young ones. And this is definitely a challenge, but also an opportunity for us to operate in 25 different countries, because now we have Tibetans who have become citizens in those countries. They speak the language, they understand the system. Only thing they need to know a little more is about the situation inside Tibet. Then they can be the best lobbyists and advocates for Tibet. And that is where we are aiming at. It takes time for any change. It does definitely incubation time, but I'm sure we'll reach there. And we have many youngsters who are here also being very responsible. Some of these channels are Tibetan channels. They're doing on their own, no pay, nothing. It's all voluntary. And Tibetan associations also all voluntary. everybody is working without any pay. That is the level of spirit. The spirit of the Tibetans inside have never been broken, even after 63 years after we came into exile. And the younger generations of Tibetans here are also quite strong. But now we have to catch the young professionals. That is very important. And we have to discuss this more in the Tibetan community meeting this coming Saturday.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. First, I'd just like to, from the floor, extend a very warm welcome to you, Sik Yong, to the UK and to this meeting. And also a big thank you to Professor Dibesh for organising. As we all know, the Chinese Communist Party will stop at nothing to silence the voice of Tibet. And also, it's doing its best to erase Tibetan culture. So firstly, is the Tibetan government in exile seriously concerned that within 1 or 2 generations, Tibetan culture will become extinct within the area controlled by China at the moment? And secondly, there are many activists, pro-Tibet, anti-CCP activists in the UK and in other countries. What does the Tibetan government in exile, what would the Tibetan government in exile like activists outside of Dharamsala and outside of Tibet to do to best help the Tibetan cause?
There is this danger, as we discussed about the boarding schools also, colonial-style boarding schools. Now, if every Tibetan changes into Chinese, then the Tibetan culture also goes away with it. That is the objective of the Chinese government, and there's a real danger that Tibetan culture may be completely erased within Tibet. But then we have been fortunate with the leadership of His Holiness. And also, we always try to look at the brighter side of things. When things go wrong, we say, okay, we lost our country, but the world gained the Dalai Lama. So that's another way of looking at it. So there is real danger of extinction inside Tibet, but what we have done in exile is exemplary, because we have managed to re-establish most of the monasteries inside Tibet. In South India, where I was born and some of us come from, we still have monasteries with 5,000, 6,000 monks and nuns. Even though we are refugees, we support 27,000, 28,000 monks and nuns from the Himalayan region, whether it's Indians or Bhutanese or the Nepalese. We are very proud of that. And it's the monastic, we are not, the CTA is not supporting the monastic institutions for their sustenance. They are surviving on their own. If we have to support all the monasteries, we won't have enough money to do that. So in exile, we have managed to preserve our culture, our religion, and our way of life through the compact communities. And those are also being threatened because of the dispersal of the compact communities. So we are coming out with ways. Now all my mind is geared towards how do we turn the challenges into opportunities. So when we came in, one challenge was the dispersal of the compact communities. The other challenge was the number of Tibetans who came over from Tibet in the last 30, 40 years and who owns nothing to call their own. So we are now planning to move them into the bigger clusters where we can preserve, and we should be prepared for another 30, 40, 50 years down the line, even if we have to struggle for that long. So every community has a saying, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. We hope for the best, reach out to the Chinese government, see how we can resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict, but at the same time, we make sure that our movement survives another 30, 40, 50 years down the line. That is one of our jobs. So we reach out to the younger generation as much as possible. Then I think this WeTag is a very good platform for every Tibetan to join that. And then of all the Tibet support groups can also work alongside that. alongside the WeTag groups. Now, this year, a few months from now, we'll be holding the International Youth Forum of Tibetans. And then we'll also have the International Tibet Support Group Conference, which will bring all the activists together. And then we'll chart our future course of action. But then cohesiveness and then pooling all our resources is very important, because resources are so limited. We have the representative Sonam here, Loshu here, and we have only 3 staffers in the Office of Tibet here. And they are responsible for Iceland, UK, the whole of Scandinavia, Baltic countries, and Poland with 3 people. But we do manage.
So, thank you. Time for last quick questions. I know there was one and there was another, right? So we'll take 2 and that's it. So.
Teshtile Sikyong, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us, and to you, DBS, as well. I just wanted to build on what you discussed earlier about the Dalai Lama pioneering democracy in exiled Tibet. And I was thinking about the recent International Buddhist Summit held in Delhi, where global issues were explored through Buddhist perspectives. And I was wondering if you could see this having potential in the future to not create, but perhaps reimagine democratic systems across the world.
Across
the world.
Sorry.
Could you end
democratic systems. The International Buddhist Summit in Delhi a few days earlier.
And that become democratic.
So kind of building on how we use Buddhist perspectives to analyze or maybe work on global issues. If this is implemented more globally, could this have an impact on reimagining democratic systems? So
to what extent Buddhism, I'm making it rephrase, but to what extent Buddhism can make democratic systems across the world better?
And the fact that there was the International Summit recently shows that there's perhaps more of a kind of ear, perhaps, open, or kind of a more open view towards Buddhist perspectives.
Okay, thank you. And one final, because we'll take it together. Yeah. Okay, Jason.
John Schreiner. You mentioned earlier about the DNA collection. As a political body, what's the CTA stance on Western organizations such as Thermo Fisher Scientific, who we know the equipment's being used to collect DNA in Tibet? Has the CTA entered into any dialogue with Western organizations that are complicit in the oppression of Tibetans inside Tibet? Because obviously as a political body, you've got a lot more power than an activist group does.
Thank you. So if you could answer whatever you can answer, and then any concluding remarks, please.
Maybe I didn't get the whole essence of your question, but when His Holiness devolved his responsibilities in 2011, he was asked this question: is this the beginning of division of church and state? And is it a good thing? But His Holiness always said, politicians, if guided by spiritual values, is the best thing. Yeah, so religion or spirituality need not necessarily be painted black and, not in harmony with politics. Now, in my case also, every time I think from a Buddhist perspective. So even in the parliament, I say it's my retreat time, because parliament is quite chaotic, but I keep my calm through Buddhist practice. So I practice my meditation there, because meditation is nothing but concentration. So you have to listen and you have to answer also. So that is there. And then you practice compassion when people speak loudly or out of turn or whatever. And also forgiveness and all that. So if you are guided by spiritual values, it's good for politics also. In democracy also, if leaders are not just guided by immediate gains or 5-year term, and then you always look for just 2 hours ago we were discussing about promises being made during the election, and after winning the election, promises are gone. That might last for 5 years. After 5 years, again, you have to go back to the public. then can you keep lying to the public all the time? Those are very short-term gains. So you should be looking for long-term gains, which spirituality can guide. So even now, some people tell me, oh, you should do this, this will help in your next election. I say, please don't tell me this. Then my whole motivation changes. If my motivation is only to win the next election, then I'm not serving my people well. If I serve my people well with all the integrity, then people will think, people will make a judgment by themselves. I don't have to insist on people that this is what we do or not do. People will realize by themselves, for themselves, what leaders are doing. So I hope that answers a little bit of, that can be applied globally to anybody who wants to follow that. The individual organizations have been campaigning against companies who are involved in assisting the Chinese government with supplies of equipments on matters that involves control of the population. From the Central Tibetan administration's side, we have not taken any overt steps to go and meet with the companies. Now, these things are becoming more and more known. These are becoming more visible. Earlier, we didn't know the Bombardier had this company there. These South African gold mining companies were operating inside Tibet. So these are becoming more visible, and then activists at every level, they are taking on their own, and I think responsible. Business also need to be more morally responsible. So otherwise, you provide them everything, and tomorrow they are firing back at you. So this is how it works, and we should understand the reality. And if all of us understand the oneness of humanity, then this problem won't be there. Till we don't realize the oneness of humanity, then there will always be differences. There will always be interests, your own personal interests, or your company's interests, or your country's interests. Don't bother about all others' interests. In Europe also, only when freedom knocked on Ukraine, Europe woke up. Do you really have to wait for some incident to happen to you to make this better world a better world? I don't think so. It has to be a continuous effort. And we all have to work towards that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
And, so before DBH concludes, I want to thank DBH for organizing this, and the university also for providing such an open platform to discuss about anything, whether it's in favor or against. It doesn't matter, but I think discussions are very, very essential to get your ideas across, whether you're able to convince others or not, but at least people know what you think and how you intend to move. And I really want to thank the university and DBH for providing us this platform to speak, and all the online listeners and watchers, hopefully listening to our story. Hopefully you will also join the cause. You will also extend your support to the Tibetans, not just only to the Tibetans, but there's so many underprivileged, so many people suffering in this world. We are all in the same boat, and we share the same sorrow. So thank you very much again.
No, again, thank you. So, of course, I'll thank the main people. I have to thank Leon, Theo, and his colleague there, because they recorded everything. Thank you so much. Who are not around, my colleagues and my students who turned up, Office of Tibet for giving us the opportunity. Well, and I did want to thank you again, because I can understand you'll have competing pressures on your time. It would not be easy, and you have to keep talking. And that's why I asked you, where does your hope come from? But the two things which you raised, which I want to end with for everyone here, is one is about nothing lasts forever. And I always say it, empires never survive beyond certain points. So while China might be very strong imperial power, who knows when it will transform and become decolonized. That's one hope. But second, if someone is suffering from pain, it's not my affair. I can say it easily. But